I'm writing this as a futile attempt to explain that which I believe is unexplainable. I only ask that to whomever is reading, please give me a chance. I'm not sure if this document will reach anyone. I'm not sure if what is written will even intrigue. What I am sure of is that I must write it. To give a bit of backstory before I give this testimonial, my name is Piddock. I am what you would call an investigator. I am not a private eye. I am not a paranormal researcher. I have no background in being an ex-cop or military official. I simply investigate. What do I investigate? A myriad of things, if you must know. However, my main line of work is finding places and documenting what I find inside. I suppose the more contemporary term is urban explorer, but I prefer the term investigator. I've done it for years now, going to and fro and trying to piece together the history of the buildings and areas that I find. I sometimes come out with nothing. I sometimes come out with an antique of some sort. I sometimes find photos, books, or letters. I started doing this hobby at a young age, probably when I was 15. I would take an old camera and walk around wherever it is I would walk. If I saw a building, or a forest, or anything that piqued my interest, I would go there. I would poke my nose inside, then leave. I've been doing this same thing for 5 decades now. It's become less of a hobby and more of an obsession. And most recently, it's become a means of fiscal earning. When you travel around as long as I have, eventually you run out of places to just stumble across that seem interesting. Don't believe me? Well, I can tell you that a cemetery is interesting the first few times, but when you start to explore abandoned hospitals or ghost towns, less and less do places like graveyards become, well, as I said, interesting. It was a few years ago when I started accepting tips. I opened an ad in local papers to contact me about my investigative prowess. Most of the time I was contacted by family members who wanted me to go to an old house and retrieve some heirloom or relic they were just too scared or lazy to find themselves. I would do this quite a lot, especially in rural areas. Now, I must be clear about this. In all of my years of exploring and scavenging, not once have I ever seen or heard a ghost. That isn't to say I haven't spooked myself by thinking too much while in the middle of a building by myself. And it certainly doesn't mean I haven't come across hermits or homeless who were less than happy I came across them. As I said though, no ghosts. I figured I would bring that up because, well, while I do not believe in such nonsense as poltergeists or demons, I have seen something most recently I can't explain. And I'm afraid that due to this phenomenon I have witnessed, I will no longer continue my work of being the scavenger I once was. Have you heard of the Orange House? That is what the young man standing before me asked. I suppose he had been reading about me or heard about me, and recognized who I was while I sat on the park bench enjoying my coffee. Excuse me? What do you mean, Orange House? The young man seemed a bit embarrassed and asked another question instead of answering my own. You're Mr. Piddock, correct? Yes, I am he. Who are you? My name is Joseph. Pleased to meet you, Joseph. Now, what was it you asked earlier? Oh, yeah, well, there is this place in town. Some of the other kids I know talk about it. It's called the Orange House. This struck me as odd because in all the time I have ever spent investigating this town, not once had I heard of this place, and I had heard just about every rumor there was to know. Yet, something about the name Orange House intrigued me, so I responded. Well, I can tell you this, Joseph. I've never heard of such a place around here, and I've been all over the area, so maybe your friends are just misleading you." "No, Mr. Piddock, they are not, because I know where it is." Now I was interested. Maybe this could be my big chance to find something new. I know it sounds rather strange for a full-grown adult to think one small comment could lead to a treasure, but I was in my 60s, and I haven't actually been out to roam for some time. So maybe it was just the potential of that feeling. The same feeling I had had all those years ago when I first started doing this. I responded to the boy, or I responded to Joseph. "Well, why not show me then?" Joseph's eyes lit up at this, and he responded happily. Okay, come on and follow me. It's just a few blocks away." I stood from my seat, slowly. As said, being in my 60s, doing certain things day to day became more of a hurdle rather than a given. I walked to the nearby trash can, threw away my caffeinated beverage, and I began to follow Joseph's lead. As we walked, I inquired a bit more about him. "So, Joseph, how did you know who I was? It's not often I'm recognized, especially by someone as young as you." "Oh, well, that I don't really know. I saw your ad in the paper with your mugshot a few days ago. I also read that story about how you went up to old Hodge's place by yourself a few months ago and found a group of bums living inside." Joseph was right. Those hermits I had mentioned earlier, well, Hodge's place is where I had found them. I was actually awarded a sum of money from the police for doing so. It turned out that a few of the homeless men had actually been wanted for vandalism and muggings around town. I digress, however. I kept following Joseph, and I asked another question. "So, how old are you exactly?" "Oh, I'm 14. Why do you ask? You're not a creep or anything, right?" "Oh, Jesus, no. I was just wondering." "Oh, okay, that's cool, I guess." Feeling awkward, I kept quiet and followed the kid, until he had stopped suddenly and pointed across the street. I had been so distracted with the conversation, I hadn't noticed we were at the edge of town. We had entered a cul-de-sac, and surprisingly, all of the houses were either empty, condemned, or up for sale. The more I think about it now, I had heard of this place before, but never explored it. It was recently abandoned a decade ago or so due to the saturation of lead particles in the soil. So it wasn't surprising that many people were more inclined to leave than wait for the ground to be tilled and replaced with new dirt. I guess the contamination was bad enough that it made the entire area to just uproot. Seems strange, but even with that, I had never explored for one main reason. There was nothing of interest to see. But I suppose in Joseph's opinion, there was something I had missed. The orange house. The house the boy was pointing at was in fact not orange. It was a simple 2-story building with a mint green paint job. Nothing out of the ordinary. He just stood there pointing. Then I asked the obvious question. "So, that's it?" Yeah, that's it." "Joseph, that's just a regular house. There isn't anything unusual about it." No, Mr. Piddock. That house is a bad house. Everyone says so. It eats kids. It eats children? What does that even mean?" "Oh, well, they say that anyone who goes inside never comes out." "That's it? That's all they say?" "Well, they also say that at night it changes." "Changes how, Joseph?" "I don't know, it just changes. It becomes different." "Does it become orange?" "No." "Then why call it the orange house?" "I don't know." I thought to myself how this was just a waste of time. I sighed, and in a frustrated tone, I retorted, "This is a waste of my time, Joseph. Sorry, but I've got better things to do." With that, I began walking away. Then Joseph spoke. "Like what?" I stopped in my tracks. What do you mean, Joseph? What better things do you have planned? What, are you scared? Now I was irritated. Scared? Me? You wouldn't believe the things I've seen or explored, Sonny. No house is going to be able to scare me so easily. Then go inside and tell me what you find. I was put on the spot. If I walked away, I would lose this argument. If I explored it, though, I would win. So being the prideful man I was, I relented. Fine then, I will. You stay here, and I'll be right back. Joseph smiled cheekily and nodded. I walked across the street to the orange house and went upstairs, onto the covered porch, and tried to open the door. No such luck. So I did as anyone would do. I walked around back and tried there. As I sauntered around on the side of the house, I took note of the windows that lined its walls. There was at least 6 to 8 of them on the building side, but it was far too dark to see into the building. I kept walking and found the back door. I walked up the small steps leading to the door and tried the handle. This time it was not locked, and I pushed the door inward. It creaked and rattled as it swung open, revealing a dimly lit interior. With that, I took my first steps inside and observed my surroundings. I noted how old the building was, and how almost everything in the small kitchen I had entered was still there. A sink full of dusty dishes, a refrigerator, appliances such as blenders and knife racks, all left intact. Strange, I thought. Strange. I continued to make my way into the house, entered the living room. Once again, everything was intact. Furniture, a box television, pictures on the wall, all left with a film of dust. Untouched by the world for years. No one had been in this house for a long, long time. I kept roaming from room to room, and once again, it was just all the same. The same everything. Nothing was out of place. And maybe that's what bothered me. Whoever had been living here had left so suddenly. It wasn't right. You think someone would have auctioned this place off, or looted, or bummed here. But there was no sign of any of that. I kept these thoughts to myself and wandered around more before finding a stairwell. It led up to the second floor. It was obvious no one had walked on these stairs for years. The dust was far too thick. I placed my hand on the handrail and put one foot on the first step. I was met with the loudest creak of my life. I then backed away from those steps and decided to go against climbing them. The one thing you learn from exploring old places is that the first thing to become unstable in abandoned buildings are the stairs, especially wooden ones. And at my age, I couldn't accept the idea of falling through. With that, I turned around and made my way back outside of the house through the kitchen. Nothing special. Just an old house. An old, fully furnished house. I walked back out from around the building and spotted Joseph waiting for me across the street. He sat on the curb, and when he spotted me, his expression was shocked. He spoke when I got near. "Wow, you really went in? What was it like? What'd you find?" Like I thought, nothing of interest. It was just an old building covered in dust. "Oh, well, I guess thanks anyway." "Thanks? Thanks for what?" "Oh, thanks for checking." "Well, either way, I gotta get going. I'll maybe see you later." "Sure, kid, sure, I'll see you later." With that, we parted ways. I walked back to the park, and I sat back down on the bench. I sat there and just thought. Thought of the orange house, about what Joseph had said, how it ate children, how it changed at night, and the way he said thanks. I thought and thought and thought. Then I closed my eyes and fell asleep. I awoke sometime later in the evening. It was dark outside, very dark. I couldn't believe it, and I felt like a foolish old man. I stood up and brushed myself off. Then I looked around to see my surroundings were all the same. No cars, no noise, and no people. Just the streetlight, illuminating the place in which I was. I began to walk towards my home. Then I saw them. A group was walking in the same direction me and Joseph had been walking just a few hours earlier. Curiously, I peered through my thin wire frame glasses. I could tell quickly it was a group of children. There was a leader at the head of the pack, a child who was slightly larger. It was Joseph. All of a sudden, it had clicked. Joseph had me explore the place so him and his group of little friends could go there and see it for themselves without fear. What had I done? I know I haven't set a good example earlier, but children shouldn't go into that place. It's a dangerous place regardless of the rumors. Not only that, but if something did in fact happen, it would be all my fault. The luck of being an old man is that if I got blamed for being the catalyst of their decision, I could just act senile. But even then, the guilt would eat at me. I couldn't let that happen. So I began to follow the group. I had to catch up to them to keep them from doing what I knew they were planning to do. They were a few blocks ahead of me by the time I started trailing them. There was no way I could catch up to them in time, so I hollered, "Hey, you kids! Hey! What do you think you're doing?" They all looked behind themselves and, in an instant, ran to the cul-de-sac at full sprint. Shit. That was all I could think. I started making my way towards them faster, until I was standing in front of the orange house. I could see through the darkness the oscillation of flashlights roaming through the house. The children had already entered. I was too late. I'd have to go in and get them. It was at times like this that I wish I had a cellular phone. I've just been too stubborn and stuck in my ways to get one. If I had owned one, I'd just call the police and let them handle it. But I had no time to tarry. So with that, I began roaming around the side of the house. I peered up at the windows I'd passed by earlier, and was shocked to see, well, decorations adorning the inside of the glass. There were paper cutouts of orange and black ghosts, pumpkins, cats, mostly things you'd see children make during October. Strange, considering October wasn't for another 3 months, but I brushed it off. The kids must have put them up earlier, so maybe they had already been inside of the house. I stopped and thought hard. If the children had already entered the house before, then there wasn't any real danger. Maybe I should just let them have their fun and just leave. Yet again, my mind traveled back to the old rickety stairwell, and I decided that I couldn't risk it, so I pressed on. I got to the back door of the building and once again ambled up the concrete steps leading to the back door. I opened it, surprised it hadn't been locked behind the kids, and once again I took steps into the orange house. When I entered, something wasn't right. The house's smell had changed. The vibe had changed. Maybe Joseph was right about this place being different at night. But if he was right about that, maybe he was right about it eating kids. No, that's nonsense. Stop fooling yourself, old man. I wandered through the kitchen, just to find the door leading into the living room was shut and locked. I knocked onto the door and spoke in a worried voice. "Kids? Joseph? This is Mr. Pittock. You kids need to come out of the house. It's late, and this place is dangerous." Silence was my only response, so I was stumped. There was no way I could break down the door, and so as far as I knew, this was the only way into the living quarters of the building. So I began looking around the kitchen. It was dark, but the streetlights in the distance illuminated just enough to where I could see. I looked around the kitchen for anything I could use to get the door open, when I spotted it, a flashlight laying on the ground. My lucky day. I reached down and grabbed the light and then turned it on. It shined brightly and allowed me to look around with much more ease. That's when I spotted something else, a cubbyhole. It was a small square door that aligned itself on the wall. I hadn't noticed it when I first entered and thought to myself, maybe, just maybe, it led to another room around the house. So I knelt down and opened the small crawl space and shined my light into it. Sure enough, it went about 10 feet before opening into one of the bedrooms of the building. I crouched down onto my old knobbly knees and crawled through the tight enclosure. It wasn't very fun. Cobwebs and ancient mouse turds lined the floor. I didn't pay it any mind, and before I knew it, I was across the tunnel and into the bedroom. I stood slowly and shined the light around. I remembered this room, but it had obviously been disturbed. Once again, Halloween decorations were scattered about. There were paper skeletons hanging on the walls, and the dark tinsel that wrapped itself around the ceiling. These kids must have been planning something. Maybe a party? Maybe something for this upcoming holiday? Whatever it was, I hadn't cared. I made my way through the room and opened the door and entered the hall. I then shut the door behind me and called out again. Kids, it's just me, Mr. Pittock. You all need to come on out. The fun is over. You need to get back to your parents and wait. Something wasn't right. At first, I thought I just had a case of disorientation, but after a few moments, I realized that the building's interior was different. Not in some horrifying way, but it was different. It had changed. The wallpaper was different. The floors were different. The architecture was different. It seemed the dust had been all but removed. I must have entered the wrong house. I must have. I turned around to open the door to the room I had just been in, but it was locked. Despite what I had wanted, I was now forced to explore this place. So that is indeed what I did. As I walked through the building, I noted the various Halloween decorations adorning almost every square inch of the walls and ceiling. Not only that, but the lights had also been turned on in some of the rooms, which didn't make any sense. I found myself getting lost in this place, this orange house. The hallways twisted into new rooms, and it seemed each door was just another entrance into a hallway. I walked for what felt like hours, just navigating a seemingly ending maze of halls. I came across various living rooms and foyers, just walking mindlessly. Each step I made in this place became stranger and stranger. Then I came to my first real shocking discovery. At the end of a hall was another crawl space. I had no other choice but to crawl through it in order to move forward. I knelt down again and made my way through. Then as I emerged on the other side, I found myself in the same bedroom I had originally entered through the previous tunnel. This can't be real. I must be losing my mind. Yet I pressed forward. I opened the door and found myself in a different hall than before. At this point in time, I wasn't scared really. I was just confused, baffled by the place. I know that logically at this point, I should have been pulling my hair out. I should have been in shock, but that wasn't the case. For whatever reason, I remained in control of my composure. I just kept walking. This house, this orange house, it just went on forever. I wasn't even sure how I'd find my way back, or if there was even a way back. For all I knew, I was trapped here forever. Or was I even trapped? I didn't know the answer. Yet, as if it had always been, I found the stairwell. I looked up the tall, arcing structure and noted how it appeared much larger than before. It seemed to twist and circle at least 3 or 4 stories. I also noted how the dust on the stairwell was still intact. all except for a group of footprints that led upwards. That's when I heard it. I heard the giggles and hushed whispers of children emanating from the floor above me. This time I spoke, more sternly, practically shouting, "Joseph! Kids! There is something wrong here. We all need to leave." No response. In that moment, I stood in front of the stairs. I stopped to try and logically dictate what was happening. I've heard that gases like carbon monoxide can lead to memory loss or confusion. Maybe this place was filled with it, and maybe that's why I had gotten lost. Or maybe the dark had just played tricks on me. Maybe I wasn't in the same house at all. Maybe I had died of a heart attack earlier, and this was the purgatory or hell I was to live in. Or maybe it was heaven. Maybe I'd finally lost it and gone insane. Was this what it was like? Was this what insanity was? Then I heard something I wish I'd never heard. A high-pitched scream. A child's scream. It resonated a chill agony and discomfort. It was loud. The loudest scream I could ever have imagined. And it came from the same place I had just previously heard the children. From the upstairs. As the shrill scream rung through my ears and reverberated through every inch of my being, it made me forget all about logic and reason. I began scrambling up the stairs. To my surprise, there were no creaks, no cracks. The stairs were completely stable. Lucky for me, I guess. However, unlucky for me was the sheer amount of stairs that were now in the house. I went around the twisting stairwell and found myself on the second floor, but it kept going. Then I made my way to what should have been the third, but once again, it kept going. I was ascending the steps for what seemed like forever, spiraling up and up and up. I was becoming exhausted, but I had to press onward. I had to continue. Just before I felt like I was going to collapse, I reached the top. There, I was staring into, well, another hallway. This hallway was different though. It was long, too long, and only a singular door lay at the end of it. I knew that's where the kids must have been hiding. I slowly walked down the hall, taking note of how the air had gotten much colder. I went to the door and slowly turned the knob. I pushed it open, expecting to see a group of children huddled in a corner hiding. That was not the case. Instead, I was met with pumpkins. The entire room was filled with pumpkins, just piled around randomly. I had no idea what to think. None of this made any sense. None of it. I entered the room and neared the pumpkins. Observing the tops of them had been cut in a circular fashion, as if they were being prepared for carving. Curiously, I walked to one of the pumpkins and shakily reached out my hand. My heart was still beating in my chest from the rapid ascension of the stairs, but now it felt like a drum, keeping a high tempo. I was mere inches from grasping the stem of one of the pumpkins before I heard a sudden voice from behind. "Mr. Piddock, don't do it!" I stopped and spun around to see Joseph standing behind me. "Joseph, it's you? Where are the others? What's going on?" Joseph just stared at me. He was speechless, pale, shaking, and worst off, pointing at my hand. "Mr. Piddock, I thought you said this place was safe." "It is safe, Joseph." "Well, it was. It wasn't like this when I first came inside. It's different now. I can't comprehend it. I've never seen or experienced anything like it. Where are the others? The other kids?" Joseph looked at me with a blank expression, his emotions hidden from me, maybe even hidden from himself. He stammered and spoke shakily. "When we first got here, we were all in a group. It was me and my brother and his friends. Somehow, as we walked around and got lost, we also got separated. I tried to find them. I tried to find a way out, but I ended up getting lost myself. Then I found this room. The pumpkin room. Joseph, this room. What is so different about it? Granted, the pumpkins are unusual, but they are just pumpkins. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Pittock. When I first found this room, there were only 4 pumpkins. Every time one of the group got lost, we would stumble upon this room, and another pumpkin was added. I don't know what it means, but I wouldn't look inside if I were you. Something tells me we don't want to see. I listened to Joseph's words very carefully, and couldn't help but agree. Maybe whatever was inside of these pumpkins was best left undiscovered. However, against my better judgment, I turned away from Joseph and neared one of the pumpkins. I stuck out my hand and clasped my fingers around the stem that protruded from the top. With a sudden yank, I popped off the makeshift top and peered inside. I was met with an unusual sight. The pumpkin was not empty. It was in fact filled to the brim with seeds and what appeared to be shredded squash-like innards. I was confused, but I wasn't done. There had to be more to this. Before I made any further moves, Joseph spoke in a concerned but curious voice. "Mr. Pittock, what do you see? What's inside?" "Nothing, Joseph, just seeds and pumpkin innards, filled all the way to the top." Let me try something. I'm not sure what I was expecting to happen, but the idea came into my head. I decided to push the gourd over. I had to know if anything else lurked inside the soupy muck that resided in this pumpkin. I placed my hands near the bottom of the large hollow fruit, and I heaved a mighty push. It tipped over and spilled its contents all over the floor. Joseph and I just stood there, shocked. Out of the pumpkin flooded and oozed the aforementioned seeds and guts, but there was more. Dozens, if not 100 large worms came pouring out with it. They wriggled and spasmed on the wooden floor like fish out of water. As well, there were roaches that scattered and began skittering and crawling away from the emptied mass. But that wasn't what shocked Joseph and I. What shocked us was the emaciated and horribly decomposed body that spilled out with everything else. It was the body of a child. It lay on the floor, curled into the fetal position. The corpse had worms sliding from in and out of its flesh, occasionally poking out of the orifices of its face as if to punctuate the horror. Joseph and I just stood there. We had no words, no scream, nothing. Just silence as we peered at the tiny dead human that lay before us. It looked as if the poor child had been thirsted and fasted until death, as if though he was locked away in that pumpkin for months on end until finally wasting away. I had mentioned how before I hadn't been scared. If you recall, I was just confused and bewildered. However, the moment I saw that body, that is when the fear set in. The fear that something in this place was malicious. I finally broke the silence and slowly backed away as I spoke. Joseph, we have to leave. We have to go right now. I looked to see that Joseph was still just standing, staring. His eyes traveled 1,000 miles, and his distant expression spoke more words than I could ever write down. Joseph was in a state of catatonic paralysis. Then he raised his hand and pointed. I looked at him and grabbed his shoulders in an attempt to snap him out of his trance. Yes, Joseph, yes, I see it too. But we have to leave. We can't. Joseph interrupted me suddenly. No, look, look! I snapped my head in the direction he was pointing and dropped my jaw. The corpse of the child was sitting upright and staring at us. At first, I assumed that maybe the child was still alive and that maybe we could help. Yet at a second glance, I understood the stark reality. The child was rotted and quite literally falling apart at the seams. There was no way it could be alive, and yet it sat there, staring at us with its empty eye sockets. The corpse cocked its head to the side, as if to express curiosity. Once again, I found myself frozen in place. The corpse then straightened its head upright and shakily stood itself upwards. Then, it began growling. It was the same type of growl you would hear from an angry animal, but more guttural. It was at that moment I noticed that around the room the other pumpkins began to wobble back and forth. Instinct took over, and I grabbed Joseph by the arm. I yanked him from the room and turned around, slamming the door behind me. As I closed the door, I saw more pumpkins begin to spill over, but I wasn't about to wait and see what was inside of them. Hurriedly, with Joseph in one hand and my flashlight in the other, we sprinted down the hall and to the stairwell. Before we were even down the first few steps, I could hear the door open and the sounds of tiny feet trouncing at full speed towards us. My heart was beating uncontrollably, but the amount of adrenaline surging through my body kept me from collapsing. Joseph must have felt the same way, because at no point did he slow down or fall behind. We descended the stairwell as fast as possible. I could still hear the very loud and very audible footfall above us as we did. Whatever those things were, they were coming after us, and something in my gut told me they assuredly mean us harm. Finally, we reached the bottom of the stairs, and we began our journey back through the halls. We ran around random corners and twisted our way through doors and entrances. Joseph and I kept this up for what felt like at least an hour. We kept going until the sounds of our pursuers had finally faded away, and the only noise we could hear were the sounds of our own steps. Finally, to the point of exhaustion, we stopped, and we fell against the wall. I turned off my flashlight, coating us in a pitch of black darkness. Joseph and I sat in silence for a long time. At no point during this had I let go of his arm. Joseph must have noticed this as well. He finally spoke. "Mr. Piddock? Don't let go of me, please. Don't let go. I don't want to be left alone here." "Neither do I, Joseph. Neither do I." Once again there was silence. Nothing but silence. The tension was so palpable you could almost slice the air with a knife. But I suppose neither me or Joseph had anything to say. What could we say? What had we even witnessed? This place. This orange house. This wasn't some paltry, haunted building. This wasn't some poltergeist or demon. This was something else. This place was different. It defied all logic and reasoning. It simply just was. Against all expectations, as I was sitting slumped, holding on to Joseph's arm, I somehow managed to fall asleep. I remember having fleeting dreams. Dreams of sunlight, dreams of clouds, dreams of happy things. Those dreams stopped as I was shook to a groggy stupor. A hurried voice spoke to me in a harsh but stern whisper. "Mr. Piddock! Mr. Piddock! Mr. Piddock, please wake up! I hear something, I hear it! Mr. Piddock, you've got to wake up!" I shot my eyes open and replied, "What? What is it, Joseph? What do you hear?" Sure enough, without Joseph needing to reply, I heard it too. It was a dragging sound. You would hear it every few seconds. A long scraping noise, then silence, then another scrape, and silence. It seemed to be getting louder with each scrape. I grabbed the flashlight and with a trembling hand turned it on. The brightness almost blinded me as it illuminated the darkness of the hallway. But after a few seconds, my eyes were able to adjust. I gripped onto Joseph's hand and stood from our sitting position. I darted the beam of light around the hall. Nothing was out of order. The same Halloween decorations adorned the walls, the paper skeletons almost seeming to mock me with their cheerful grins. The posters of jack-o'-lanterns that littered the area didn't help either. These childish ornaments only cemented the dark juxtaposition of Joseph and mine's situation. We were lost, and slowly I was losing hope that we would ever leave this place alive. Whatever we had walked into wasn't something humans were supposed to enter. We had somehow stepped into the veil of madness. We had managed to cross a barrier, or a threshold that was never intended to be crossed. All these thoughts were clouded by the persistent noise though. It was indeed becoming louder each time it sounded. It came from my right side, so I shined the light in that direction. It beamed to the end of the hallway, but didn't show anything. Whatever was making that dragging sound was around the corner. I can't really explain what made me decide to walk over and investigate. I just wish I'd never had. I just wish we had sat there and let the darkness take us. I just wished.